much, and delighted you are all able to join us today. I am very pleased to introduce our two panelists today. First is Kelly Kay, who is a BA in English, 1994, BA in English from Ohio State. Today, she is Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Toyota Research Institute. And I hope to learn more about that today. Our other panelist is Louie Pastor, BA in History, 2006. Today, he is Executive Vice President, Chief Corporate Development Officer, and Chief Legal Officer at the Xerox Corporation. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, David.
Thanks.
Well, as we said, the sort of the purpose of this conversation is to, well, to give you an opportunity to reflect on your time at Ohio State, but also to help us think through the possibilities for a degree in the humanities. It's sometimes said, I think unfairly, but it's sometimes said of humanities graduates, well, you know, there's nothing you can do with that aside from, I don't know, being a teacher or being a barista at Starbucks, something wrong with those jobs. But there's a sense that there's not really a career path or career opportunities for those of us who've majored in the humanities. And I think as both of your life stories demonstrate, that is far from the truth. And I think that's a big part of what we want to try to get today from this conversation. So again, thank you both for joining us. I'd like to ask you both to sort of start off by telling us why Ohio State? What drew you to Ohio State in the first place? Louie, why don't you begin, please?
Sure. So I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, a town called Wyoming.
Oh, yeah.
You know, honestly, I looked predominantly when I was looking at colleges and things in the Midwest. I'm the youngest of 5 brothers, and I didn't want to go kind of that far from home. And, you know, when I went on visits and spoke to people about, and that's kind of the biggest thing for me was the peer feedback. So talking to people who I knew who had been older than me in school and at the schools that they went on to and what their experiences were like, you know, Ohio State sort of checked all the boxes for me in terms of, you know, opportunities. It just seemed like a place where you could go and, you know, if you weren't quite sure the path that you wanted to go on and, you know, the direction that you wanted to head, you were going to have a lot of things to choose from. And, you know, so I wasn't one of those kids who came to college sort of knowing exactly what I wanted to major in, knowing what career path I wanted to go down. I'm not sure I actually answered to some of those questions until I was in my late 20s. But you know, so for me, it was about the breadth of opportunities, both academically and socially. And I use the socially term very broadly because, you know, there's so many organizations to get involved in. And so that was really the main draw for me. And so that sort of strength across the board at Ohio State kind of sealed the deal.
Kelly, how about your decision to come to Ohio State?
Sure. So my story is kind of the same and kind of different. I also had no idea what I wanted from a career perspective when I was thinking about going to college. And in particular, I was the first person in my family to even consider going to college. So it was a bit of a shock to the system for the rest of the family as I'm kind of pondering what I want to do for a living. I actually was living in Columbus. I'd gone to St. Francis de Sales, which was a high school there in Columbus, close by. And a lot of my friends were going to Ohio State. And I actually only applied to Ohio State because I didn't think I could afford to go anyplace else, because I didn't think I could move someplace else. I wanted to be able to be close to home in case I had to move back in, because I was kind of going to school hand to mouth, kind of working a quarter, paying for school the next quarter, kind of going back and forth. So it took me a little while to get through. And I think Ohio State really gave me the flexibility to do that, where I was able to kind of choose when I went and when I didn't go based upon when I had money to go. You know, now looking back, if I had more experience in going to college, or if anyone in my family had experience, I would have known I could have tried to get loans to go to school. But I didn't know that back then. And, you know, I think Ohio State really just gave me the opportunity to kind of explore what I wanted to do. As Louie said, I didn't know if I wanted to go into sciences, if I wanted to go into English, what I wanted to do when I went. And by having the opportunity to take the BERs, or the basic education requirements, it really allowed me to kind of flit around to different areas until I found what was comfortable for me. And that's how I ended up in the College of Humanities.
Well, that's interesting that you both made reference to the fact that that Ohio State allowed you to explore, or gave you the flexibility or the freedom to explore. I think I encounter so many students today that that feel like they have to have a career decision and a major determined even before they arrive. And I wonder if your experiences were unique. I mean, based on what you know from your classmates. In other words, do you think it's uncommon that students would arrive to university maybe wanting to explore different possibilities, not having a sense of what the ultimate career goal is?
I don't think the experience is uncommon. I do think there is increasing pressure. And look, I felt this even at the time. You know, I can talk very fondly now about sort of, you know, how much I wanted to explore and, you know, the value of that today in retrospect. But I recall even at the time feeling, you know, some pressure either externally or frankly internally, just as a result of what I was seeing other people do, of, well, why haven't I figured it out yet? I mean, I'm 18 years old. I should know what I want to do with my life. And that to me now seems like just a ridiculous statement. At the time, you know, my inner monologue was telling me that that was actually rational, because I was seeing maybe some other folks who did have it more figured out. And I think that notion has only increased, the intensity of that has only increased in the time since I was at Ohio State. So, I mean, I now have nieces and nephews who are approaching kind of college application time. And the conversations I have with them, luckily my kids are much smaller and their preschool applications are quite involved, but not to the same extent. Like that pressure is rising. And I think there is a lot of value in sort of holding the line against it and saying, you know, it's okay to not know that, you know, you want to be a chemist or something, you know, highly specific. And allowing yourself the ability to navigate it based on, you know, an evolving set of tastes and preferences and opportunities.
Kelly, I saw you nodding in agreement, I assume.
Yes, I think I look at my friends that I started university with, and many of them, you know, whether it was because they were getting pressure from their parents or because they thought they knew what they wanted to do at 18, went down a very specific path and said, I'm going to be a doctor. So I'm going to take all of these courses associated with being a doctor. A lot of those folks ended up kind of deviating from the path. So even when you go in the door thinking you know what you want, after a couple of years or even after a few quarters, you're going to find maybe you like something completely different. And, you know, where does your skill set actually lie? And for me, again, like Louie, I was probably 27 before I really figured out what I wanted to do for a living. And when I found kind of my niche, like the thing that was going to make me successful. And I do think that the broad-based experience that I had at Ohio State by kind of taking these different classes and experimenting with what I was interested in really helped me kind of learn what I wasn't interested in as well as what I was interested in.
So does that give some indication then about why you ended up in the humanities, Kelly? Or give us a sense of why you decided to major in English?
Sure. I love to read, and I used to lose myself in books as a kid and still do today. So for me, it was like a natural thing to go into the humanities and particularly into English because I wanted to read more and I wanted to read different types of books because I was really only exposed again to what my family had or what they taught me in high school. But as soon as I was at Ohio State, the whole world opened up to things like Chaucer and Shakespeare and things that I really wasn't going to get exposed to before. And, you know, just learning more and being free to kind of learn why writers write and what they write and what it means and all the underlying undercurrents and things like that of literature that you really don't get when you sit down and read a science fiction book, which I'll admit science fiction is my favorite. But science fiction was started by Shakespeare, so that's okay.
I'm a sci-fi fan too. I'm sorry, Louie, please.
I was just going to say, I had sort of a similar experience in terms of the loving to read component, except mine was different in that as a kid, I didn't really have it. It was something I developed a lot more as I got older. And Ohio State is actually the place where I think I most developed it, because I was the one selecting not necessarily what particular book I was reading, but the topics, right, that you know, the courses that were organized around. Right. So for me, you know, in high school, if you had asked me in high school if I love to read, I'd be like, no. I mean, I hate it. Everything is just forced upon us. And like these things are, I don't see a ton of value in it. And then I, you know, in college, when I started to have the ability to choose the topics, like the subject matter, realized that I actually do love to read. And also that the skills that I had built through the earlier pieces of my parts of my education were quite applicable and valuable to have as I was reading these things, like those critical thinking abilities, and you know, extrapolating out like the themes and the messages in the content.
So you've both mentioned reading, and just out of my own curiosity, I mean, we talked today about reading as something maybe we do for pleasure. That's sort of the purpose of reading, read for pleasure. I wonder, has reading been at all valuable or important in your current roles, your current careers?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I went to law school after, you know, after college, and law school is entirely, it's a lot more than reading, but being able to synthesize information, you know, and take very complicated topics that are written upon in you know, some vast way and distill them down into sort of digestible concepts and then debate them. So for me, it's more about ideas than it is even reading and discourse in general. And reading and writing are just fundamental components of that. And they force you, you know, when you're having a conversation, you can move quite quickly through topics, and you don't necessarily need to like double click and go down and fully explain. But when you put something in writing, you absolutely need to do those things so that people understand the context. And on top of that, you need to do it in the most economical fashion, right? So, you know, especially now that the written communication has gotten, you know, it's now emails and text messages and Slack messages and Microsoft Teams messages and all these, you know, it's getting shorter and shorter. And being able to articulate very, you know, complex ideas and thoughts in simple ways in an economic fashion is incredibly valuable.
Kelly, your experiences with reading as a professional?
Well, so I also went to law school. So hello, fellow lawyer. So I do think the humanities do give you this opportunity also to go to law school, which we didn't really talk about, because I think it gives you the broad base to make you think in a very critical way that helps a lot with law school. But in particular, you know, one of the things that really attracted me to law school is I knew you had to read a lot when you went to law school, and it's all stories. If you think about the cases that you read when you go into law school, it is tons and tons and tons of really fun and interesting stories because they're the things that make up our law. And you're reading 180 pages a night sometimes, and you have to be able to digest it, determine what the case is about or what the story is about, and what are you trying to learn from it. And law school is really a lot about analogy as well, and being able to read those stories and apply those fact patterns to other situations. And I think being able to read and comprehend and do so quickly is pretty important as you think about your future. Now, a lot of the work I do is with technology. And oddly, a lot of it is reading. So we are a research institute, which means we spend a lot of time at the Toyota Research Institute doing patents and papers. And our papers are subject to publication around the world on interesting research topics, very complex research topics in autonomy and things like that. So I have to read those, make sure they're okay, make sure I understand them so I can actually communicate with my employees. So reading has really helped me a lot, even in digesting the scientific side of things at my company today.
I want to take you back again to your undergraduate experiences and ask you both, what was your most meaningful or important academic experience? Let's start with you, Kelly. What was your most important academic experience when you were here as an undergraduate?
So you're probably asking the wrong person first. I worked a lot. So I had 2 jobs when I was in school to pay for school. So I didn't actually have a lot of time for extracurricular activities. And I don't think I ever met with a professor. And I think that that's something I wish, again, I had known going in, that I should be doing those things. So I didn't have an academic advisor, or I probably had one, but didn't know where they were or how to even get in touch with them. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks, and I would highly recommend that as you go into university, that you spend time to learn who your academic advisor is, spend time with them, have them coach you on things like that, especially if it's your first time in the family going to a university. Because I think it does add a lot to the experience. When I chose to go into law school, I really thought I was kind of scared because I didn't have that connection to the professors, because I didn't know I needed to have it. And when I got to law school, they were a lot more aggressive about kind of grabbing onto you and making you come and have meetings with them. So for me, it was a lot more about working and making sure I could continue through my education process while working and be effective at it. That didn't stop me from going to Ohio State games with my mom, which was a wonderful experience of sharing that with my mother. But otherwise, I was not a member of any club, and I didn't have an advisor.
Well, speaking as an OSU faculty member, I can tell you I very much enjoy hosting students in my office hours. We're always very keen to have to interact with students outside of class like that. Louie, your most memorable or important academic experience as an undergraduate?
I think there were a few things that I'll sort of categorize all together, which is I was somebody who went to office hours and not necessarily like I would seek out every professor that I had, but specifically in courses that I thought that were particularly interesting and where the professor was going to have a lot to offer in that setting. Now, on top of that, I also was the student representative on the Council of Academic, I think it was called the Council of Academic Affairs at the time. But essentially a cross-functional interdisciplinary committee, established by the provost to look at, the entire general education curriculum at Ohio State, which I was one student on it. There were 9 faculty members from all different parts of the university. And so getting to be a part of those conversations and see how the faculty members were actually thinking about potentially reforming the whole GEC, what it was called at the time, approach, and sort of how credit hours were, what credit hours had to be met in order to actually get your degree and things like that outside of the majors. Those were very valuable experiences for me, and they sort of lead me to my bigger point, which is one about kind of the value of mentorships. And I think sometimes something that nobody ever explained to me when I was growing up and kind of going through these things and figuring out how to navigate things was, people spoke about mentorships, but they didn't explain that, a mentorship relationship does not have to be, A, you don't only have one, and B, it doesn't have to be something that is, that spans multiple years and decades and is this huge investment of time from both people. I mean, there are people who now, when I look back at my career, at the time I didn't think of them as mentors, and maybe it was only for a short period of time, one professor in one class over one semester that I met with 4 or 5 times. But that was a pivotal relationship for me at that point in time that helped me get and figure something out to advance to the next step. And so those, if I added all of those up over the course of my career so far, from the point when I graduated high school to now, I would say I've probably had 50 mentors, And so I think being open to those relationships and seeking them out, but not necessarily coming at them with a preconceived notion of, okay, this needs to be a long-term mentorship relationship and I need it to be, based on certain parameters, but just having conversations and taking some lessons from them and then integrating them into the way you approach things, and building off of that is something I think is really valuable and gets back to why I think Ohio State is so, when you get into the breadth of experiences and being able to have those relationships, on many different levels and in many different ways is extremely valuable.
I find that, of course, I've been at this a while. I've been a professor for nearly 30 years, not all at Ohio State. I find today I do as much mentoring as I do professing. I think that's just I think if you're a professor, especially in the humanities, I think you find yourself more and more in that role, and it's one that I welcome and one that I embrace. I'd like you both to take us back to right after you graduated, and to tell us what your life was like after you graduated at Ohio State. What does that path look like? And eventually, I want to ask you about where you are today and your career pathways. But right after you graduated, take us back to that moment.
So
Kelly, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Louie.
I thought we were trying to switch off, so I thought maybe I should take this one first.
By all means.
But I went straight from undergrad to law school, and so for me, I knew by the time I hit kind of like my junior year that I was going to want to go on in my education. I had thought about sort of staying even the academic route and pursuing, a master's, PhD, a professor career. And I settled on law school for a myriad of reasons. And so, I just shifted my focus academically, but it was a very much a continuation and almost a doubling down of what I was doing, just even with an even more intense rigor. But it was also me a little bit punting on the final decision of, okay, well, what am I going to do to, make an income at some point? And that was I knew I was going to be a lawyer, obviously, but that's a pretty broad spectrum.
Kelly, I know you went off to law school, but was it the same sort of decision tree?
No, I still actually didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I graduated. I actually got a job as an accountant right out of undergrad, because I had taken some accounting courses at the same time I was taking English courses. It wasn't enough to be a minor, but I learned enough to be able to operate as an accountant in a company. So I spent about a year and a half in a company as an accountant. And then realized it really wasn't what I wanted to do for a living. And I kind of laugh now because I'm a CFO and I kind of gave up accounting way back then. So it was kind of a tricky path to get to CFO. But when I was sitting there crunching numbers and using a calculator, and we also used pencils and green pieces of paper back then when you were an accountant, I was like, you know what, this isn't what I want to do. I'm not doing the thing that makes me happy, which kind of going back to that reading thing again. And the idea came to me to take the LSAT and kind of see if I could get into law school and wing it. And I know I hate to say wing it, but take a chance. That's probably a better thing, to take a chance on going to law school. I had never even met a lawyer when I went to law school. It just seemed like what I should do because I like to read. And there were always lots of books in the law school. So I managed to get accepted into a couple of law schools, but again, decided to stay in Columbus. And I went to Capital Law School. And that was, so I was already older because it took me longer to get through undergrad because I was working and going to school part-time on and off there. And then I went and worked for a couple of years and then I went to law school. So really by the time I graduated from law school, I was already 28 years old. And it was really in that law school time where I found myself. I was the wallflower that probably was afraid to go and talk to a professor or raise your hand in class or join a community group or something like that. In undergrad, but when I got to law school, I kind of found my voice and found myself. So again, I think if I wasn't willing to take a chance and kind of focus on that thing I loved, which was reading, I never would have even thought about going to law school.
I still encounter a number of students. Maybe this is my own bias coming through, but I encounter a number of students that don't see the connection between humanities undergraduate degrees and undergraduate preparation and law school. The connection with law school is a new revelation for them, and I wonder if you'd speak a little more to that. Why was majoring in English, let's say, why was that such? I mean, we talked a little bit about this, but how did it help you when you were actually in law school, taking law school classes? And I'll ask Louie the same thing about history classes.
Yeah, so for me, it was about the critical thinking components, the reading comprehension component, the speed with which I was able to read, and then really being able to pull the stories out of things. So I think my English background and the history that I think is part of what you read when you're in literature classes or English classes really helped, as well as I took some linguistics classes as well that kind of helped me in kind of how I was looking at language a little bit differently. And I think that really helped me in law school, so that I was much quicker than others at being able to get through the materials that we had to read each night, as well as really pulling out the key components of what we were reading, and really learning a lot really quickly through that.
Louis, how
Yeah.
did studying history help you for law school?
I mean, I could say almost everything Kelly just said. You know, I think with maybe some slight variation, which is, you know, with history, you were always trying to get to the why. You know, it wasn't just about the what, it was the why and the how, and being able to sort of pull that out. And even, you know, oftentimes there isn't universal agreement on why things happen, right? And so being able to, you know, make your own decision about what you think is the right answer, and but while also being able to kind of debate that. I think there's just a natural intersection there, and you know, a path, if you will. So that's probably the biggest thing for me. I think maybe the only other thing I would mention is the ability to kind of like spot patterns and analogize, and you know, there's a lot of that when you're studying history as well. So you know, themes and patterns, and being able to analogize between scenarios, because so much of what you're studying in law school is how the decisions that are made inform the decisions that get made when new facts arise, right? Everything is based on what's been said before, and accepted universally almost as common law.
Well, I think that one of my takeaways from this conversation today is going to be that both of these humanities disciplines provided you skills. I think far too many people think that humanities is about sort of the content, right? That you know a lot about, you know, the Roman Empire, or that you've read Leaves of Grass, and that's important. I mean, that's clearly very important. But you've both sort of emphasized the skills that you developed. And I think that's something that's oftentimes lost on students who wonder about the value, or especially the vocational value of the humanities. And so really appreciate that. I want to go on and talk about your careers sort of after law school, but I just want to remind the audience that as you have questions, please write these up in the Q&A function there. We'll curate these. We'll incorporate these into our conversation. How did you, and maybe this is skipping a number of steps, but how did you end up in your current roles, in the industries that you're in? Kelly at Toyota, the Toyota Research Institute, Louie at Xerox. Louie, why don't you tell us what was the connection from law school to Xerox? Whatever steps were there along the way.
Oh, that's it was highly non-linear, is how I describe it. So after law school, I went to go work at a firm in New York City called Simpson Thacher and Bartlett. It's like a very prestigious white shoe law firm, is sort of how it's described, with an incredible roster of clients, very large banks like JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, and also the kind of who's who of private equity, Blackstone, KKR, Apollo. And one of the things that I sort of learned or discovered in law school was this whole world of deal making, you know, mergers and acquisitions and capital raising and all these things that frankly I hadn't really thought very much about it in college, or been that exposed to. And that's how I ended up at Simpson Thacher. When I discovered those things and was interested in them, I went to find the firm that I felt, you know, sort of had the best practice in those respects, and started working there. I spent about 4 years there. The first 2 years, I would say I didn't enjoy it that much. It's a very, very hard grind. But I learned an incredible amount. And by the end of the second year, I sort of knew enough to be dangerous, and really could advise clients at least a little bit on my own, and realized how much I enjoyed that. And again, I can't emphasize enough like the value of mentorships. And one of the things that happened to me sort of later in my second year there was that I met some young partners who sort of began actually showing me the ropes and teaching me and explaining to me actually how the practice worked, and really a whole lot more than just churning out the work and the work product. And so I was very happy there. I saw a future for myself there, but I always, and this probably isn't going to be surprising based on kind of what I was describing earlier, but I was always somebody who, you know, if a recruiter called, or if somebody called about an opportunity, you know, in any other respect, I would still take the call, because I always wondered what else was out there. And I felt like if you didn't take a call and talk to people, you didn't really even know like what the art of the possible was, and kind of what opportunities there even are in the world. So I took a linear path from kind of undergrad to law school to a law firm. But I always felt like there must be kind of more out there. So, and even though I wasn't unhappy, I would still pick up the phone. And one day my phone rang, and it was a recruiter, and they were like, "Hey, you know, I have this opportunity at an investment company." And for what I was doing at the time, that had a very specific meaning. There's a law called the Investment Company Act of 1940. It's called the 40 Act. And it's a very specific practice, and it gets to like representing mutual funds and things like that. And that was not what I did. And I was, you know, like, "Oh, I'm not really that kind of lawyer, but, you know, thanks for the call." And they were like, "Oh, well, it's not really a regulated investment company." I was like, "Well, all investment companies are regulated investment companies. So I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Like, are you talking about a hedge fund?" He was like, "No, it's not a hedge fund." I was like, "Okay, like, what is it?" And he was like, "Well, if you tell me you're interested, then I'll tell you what it is." Okay, I'm interested. And he was like, it's an opportunity to go work for Carl Icahn. And at the time, so the first thing I said to him was like, your pitch is all messed up here, man, but I'm not going to tell you how to fix it, because I actually am interested in this. And at the time, this was like 2013, Carl was very actively in this public fight with Michael Dell for Dell Technologies. Michael Dell. So Carl Icahn.
Yeah, for our younger viewers, remind us who Carl Icahn is.
Carl Icahn's like, as much as he would probably hate me saying this, he's like the original corporate raider from the 1980s. But he's had this long, storied career where he's made billions upon billions of dollars by effectively targeting mismanaged companies and taking control of them through one mechanism or another, and extracting a whole lot of additional value. In the 80s, that was very much a takeover and breakup story. So he was a very controversial figure, and that's why people called him a corporate raider. He's sort of gone through a rebranding over the course of the last few decades, where he's turned from a corporate raider to what's now called a shareholder activist. Where he takes minority stakes in large public companies and, you know, advocates for certain types of changes that are designed to benefit shareholders. So, you know, sell underperforming units, or, you know, change your capital allocation strategies, things like that. And so at the time, Carl was in this very public battle with Michael Dell for Dell. For the company. Michael Dell was the founder. He owned like 15% of the company. He was trying to take it private. Carl thought that his price was too low, so he went and bought a bunch of the stock in the open market, and then said he would like to buy the company. And they got in this very public fight about it. And so I went through these rounds of interviews, and I ended up getting an offer to go work for him. And it was a very idiosyncratic environment. It's not very institutional. He doesn't really manage anybody else's money, so he doesn't need a huge infrastructure of people. And so I ended up being on a fairly small team and working a lot with him directly. And one of the investments that we made while I was there that I was very involved in was an investment in Xerox. Xerox is a publicly traded company. We bought about 10% of the stock. At the time, the company owned a whole services business that now is a separate publicly traded company called Conduit. But at the time, it was all part of one company, and we thought it should be split up. We ultimately agreed with the company that they would do that. And over time, there was a change in management, and the person who ended up becoming the CEO was somebody who I had worked with while I worked for Carl. He was a consultant that we had used in certain scenarios. And when he took this job, he was like, why don't you come here and work for me here? And so I left, and I became the general counsel here at Xerox. That was a fairly delicate diplomatic dance and exit, because I didn't really want to make an enemy out of Carl. And so to this day, we're on very, very nice terms, and he's still a large investor in Xerox today and very supportive of our strategy.
Yeah, don't want to make an enemy of him, I guess, right?
No.
Kelly, tell us the path that brought you to the Toyota Research Institute.
Sure. First, I think, Louie, you had a great career. That's really cool. So thanks for sharing that.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. So a little bit different on my side. When I got out of law school, I actually took a job at Bank One in Ohio, in Columbus. Their headquarters was there. So I went straight from law school in-house. I never worked at a law firm. Never wanted to work at a law firm. Didn't think I could handle it from an hours perspective. I think I ended up working harder than I would have if I was in a law firm. But I took a role as a regulatory lawyer at Bank One. And my first project was something called an online home equity loan, which back then didn't exist. There was no online banking back then. And it was a project that had kind of sat around the bank for a while, and none of the other lawyers wanted to take it on. And I was kind of the young pup fresh out of law school, the first person they'd ever hired fresh out of law school. And I took on the project because I was the only one that had a computer on my desk. And that was kind of the beginning of my tech career. And I started working directly with the product teams on how to design products online to comply with traditional regulations. And that led me to work at wingspanbank.com, which was a totally online bank that Bank One was working with First USA at the time to create. This was kind of early days. Then they merged with First Chicago, and now are owned by JP Morgan. But while I was working in Delaware on this completely online bank, which was a conglomeration of external resources that we were tying a bunch of contracts together to actually launch, I was spending a lot of time working on the new privacy laws that were coming out and how were we going to comply with those, and working with the regulators on how online banking should ultimately be regulated. And yes, this is a world where you couldn't even look at your bank balance online back then. So just really helped develop these really cool online services for one of the largest banks out there. While I was in California talking to some other lawyers about privacy and online stuff, which was kind of a whole new field back then, I met the first lawyer from eBay. We went out, had a couple of drinks, and the next day he's like, hey, why don't you come in for an interview? I'm like, I'm not looking for a job. I'm a conservative bank lawyer. I live on the East Coast. I'm not moving to crazy California. And he's like, oh, just come on in. And those were the days when they couldn't find people to work in California. There was just, every job was getting snapped up, or every person was getting snapped up for jobs at startups. And eBay was a startup back then. And I actually interviewed the next day. They made me an offer at the end of the day, and I moved 10 days later to California to work at eBay in, I guess, 1999. I had an amazing career at eBay. Kind of everything was thrown at you full speed. And they also had a payments company called BillPoint at the time that competed with PayPal. So I did some work on that and really kind of stayed in that regulatory payments thing for a bit, but also a lot of contract negotiation, a lot of M&A work. Basically, you did everything at eBay, constructed my desk my first day. Then we bought PayPal, and I got to work on the acquisition of PayPal. At that point, Elon Musk owned PayPal. So we got to negotiate with him. And PayPal was it was an interesting deal that we did at the time. And I ended up, because I worked on the diligence and worked on the deal, getting asked to work at PayPal. So I took the role at PayPal, and it was to actually launch our international office. So PayPal didn't yet have operations overseas. And they moved me to Singapore to set up the office and to start the process of working with the product teams again on how do we launch an online payments tool globally. And we spent some time, or I spent a lot of time, flying around Asia and meeting with regulators on how do we actually structure the rules in these countries to allow PayPal to operate. So I spent about 10 years in total living between Asia and London, kind of to work on all these things. I also got to live in India for a year when I was at eBay, and a year in Hong Kong, 2 years in London, rest in Singapore, and then finally moved back to America. For me, it was a career decision to move back to America. I wanted to be a general counsel, and I didn't think I would ever get to do that if I was in Asia. Because basically the headquarters were all in the US, and if I was out in Asia, I was never going to get that role. So I actually moved back and became the Deputy General Counsel of the Wikimedia Foundation, which is Wikipedia. So spent some time there. I wanted to get out of the mold of being a finance bank lawyer or regulatory lawyer, and did a lot of work there on First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, learned a lot about nonprofits, because Wikimedia is a nonprofit. And then I actually got my dream job offer, which was to be the general counsel of a payments company. So I went right back to payments, but by then I had a little bit broader opportunity there. So I did become a general counsel, and that's at that payments company where I kind of learned that the humanities, when we go back to the humanities, come into play, because I spent a lot of time working with people. Again, there was a lot of science in the payments realm. They asked me to be the CFO at some point, and then ultimately the president and COO of that company. And it was really, I think, that beginning of kind of dabbling in so many different things when I was at Ohio State that gave me a broad enough background to really be able to think about and handle the issues that were thrown at me as I took kind of a broader role beyond the law. And that really set me up for my role now that I have at TRI, where basically we're a very technical company. We actually do autonomous vehicle development, robotic developments, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and advanced materials design and discovery, which is, they're all very scientific fields. But again, I'm able to lead a team of 400 and some people in an area that I'm not an expert in, just because of that broad background that I started with. And that's my crazy career path.
Well, I'd say non-linear, I think, was the term that Louie used. And it sounds like you both.
It's very cool, Kelly.
Well, and so there's I had another question in mind, but we've received a question from the audience, and it's a thoughtful one. Can you make a living with an undergraduate degree in the humanities without going to law school or some other sort of grad school? I'll leave that to one of you to, or both of you to think about.
I definitely think you can. Like I think that we're both. It's ironic that we have sort of similar paths in that we went to law school, and although that may be where the similar paths actually end, because while neither of us have a linear story, they're both quite different. But I think thematically, the thing that you see between the two of us that's really the same is this ability to deal with, probably fast-paced environments, things changing rapidly, and changing from what it was maybe when you got there into something very different. And, I think that's particularly valuable in today's world when, people are constantly, every company that's out there is trying to identify white space, right? Where are the areas that the market's not quite there yet? How do I get there, right? And what can I do once I'm there? And what core capabilities do I have today that I can leverage into that space? So I think the most difficult thing, oftentimes, I think, with a humanities environment, if you don't want to go to grad school, is finding the right starting point, right? And I think if you can find the right entry point, your skill set is going to be there and it's going to be applicable, right? I think that where people get very, concerned about the level of focus that there is and look for, hey, I need to know today because there's going to be a company out there with an opening and it's going to have, 4 walls around a box, and I need to make sure that I, on paper, fit within that box so I can get through. And a lot of times the solution to that, and this gets back to something I mentioned before as well, is relationships, right? And so developing mentors, within Ohio State, or frankly through other professional and development opportunities that you have, is oftentimes going to be what leads to those, to the entry point. But the skill set is, you don't have to go to law school to have those skills, further refined and honed. And I know plenty of people who have gone straight through, and look, the 3 years that both Kelly and I spent in law school, if you spent those 3 years working, you picked up skills probably that we didn't pick up during that time, and accelerated development in ways that we didn't. And so I think more than anything, it's about finding the right entry point. And because once you're in and you are getting the experience, that's really when you start to take off developmentally.
Kelly, your thoughts on this?
Sure. So I'll just use my company as an example. So like I said, I have 400 and some people. About 60% of the team members are PhDs from some sort of science. The rest of the folks, they may have just an undergraduate degree, they may have a master's degree, but there's plenty of roles out there in different fields that don't require a degree past an undergraduate degree. So I do think there are plenty of careers out there. And as Louie said, it's about getting your foot in the door. A lot of times, I encourage my nieces to get internships when they were in college. It was a great opportunity for them to see what they were interested in and kind of get their foot in the door at a company, to get a mentor, to have someone who's going to be your sponsor as you start looking for a role and be your reference. So I think I would recommend going down the path of trying to get an internship so you can, again, explore different opportunities for you, get that mentorship, get the reference that you need to kind of get your foot in the door at the next thing you are passionate about. And I think it's about being passionate too. You have to do something you love. I got a job without an advanced degree. I didn't love it, so I went back and got an advanced degree to get a different job.
I think on the passion point, because it's funny, I talk a lot about this with folks that I mentor and that reach out to me for advice, and I always tell them, like, you may not be passionate in something today, but that doesn't mean you're never going to be passionate about it. So, and oftentimes what I've found is I can end up being very passionate about things, once I realize that I'm actually quite good at it, or that I spend a lot of time doing it and I've developed some expertise in it. So just, thinking back to when I first started my career and I spoke about those first 2 years, the once I sort of, like, there's like almost like a light bulb, right? That moment of, wow, I actually now understand how some of these pieces fit together. And now I'm much more interested in this because I get the bigger picture. And so there's also an element of, and this is always something everyone's trying to balance, I think, is between ambition and patience, right? And not necessarily being enamored with a particular opportunity on day one, knowing or keeping in mind that may change, the deeper you get into it. So I'm not saying that, Kelly, if you had maybe stuck with it, you would be the world's greatest accountant now. I mean, I think you have to trust your gut on things. And also I think, especially after you've spent some time in a role, whether or not it's for you. But I think that, not having an expectation that day one you're going to be passionate or even, just very interested in every task that you do as part of a job. But if you're sort of overall interested in, the environment, the company, the mission, right, sort of finding your way into the particular area that you're going to be passionate
about. Before we take any more questions from the audience, I want to go back to this nonlinear career path description that you both use. And I mentor a number of students that I think are terrified at that prospect. What they want is the sort of the certainty of a linear path. And you've both described a very sort of peripatetic, nonlinear, almost, well, I want to say meandering. Is that, maybe that's the reality more than the exception. In other words, maybe that's the rule rather than the exception. And maybe it is unreasonable to expect a sort of a straight linear career path. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. Or
I don't think it's unreasonable. I would I would actually change the description of what you said to
Please do.
what they think they want is a linear career path, because certainly, and I sort of see Kelly nodding a little bit right now. I mean, if you had asked me at 20 years old, do you want a linear or a non-linear career path? I would have said linear. You don't know what a non-linear career path would look like, right? So you're like, oh, well, yeah, if I can track my sort of entry point and exit point, right, directly, I can take a lot of comfort in that. And I think the part that you just don't understand or know at 19, 20, 21 years old is how much fun the nonlinear path is. And in fact, you can be more successful on a path like that. And while unquestionably there is a level of risk with it, because there's less, there's less clarity on next steps at each point, right? I think it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what those other opportunities are like, and because you don't have visibility into it, you can't forecast it. I think it would almost be unreasonable for a 20-year-old to say, "Oh, I'm looking for a non-linear career path." That's what I would like. I'd like to not know, at 20 what I could do at 35. No, I mean, they want to know. Everybody wants to know. Right, but I think people just have to realize that you may actually be selling yourself short if what you're constantly chasing is certainty.
Kelly, reflections?
So I think I use the words I finally found my dream job and became a general counsel of a payments company. Now I've got my dream job as the CFO and EVP of a technology company. So I think your dream job comes along with each new opportunity, and it is about this nonlinear approach to exploring and doing what you're passionate about. And I found myself to be very mission driven. And this idea of working for companies that I believe in what they're doing and why they're doing it matters more to me than almost the actual job that I have. Which kind of has led me to a lot of the companies that I've worked at. And I think you have to be open to this nonlinear path if you're doing what you're passionate about, because that's what you're going to be good at. Again, being an accountant back then, I was really good at it. I was always able to find the fraud and the 1 penny that I was off or whatever it was. But was I passionate about finding that 1 penny? Sometimes, but not as much as I think I wanted to be. And to me, that was important and led me down my nonlinear path. And I think there's always change. Companies are full of constant change, especially in this environment, whether it's technology changing. So jobs change as technology changes. There's reorgs in companies. And if you're not equipped to deal with it, it is very stressful. And people do like to know, like, what is my job tomorrow? What is my job next year? What am I going to do in 5 years? I mean, that used to be the standard interview question. Where do you want to be in 5 years? Everyone had to know where they were going to be in 5 years, like have this path. And I never had an answer to that 5-year question. When I was 18 years old, I didn't know what I wanted, and I'm in my 50s and I still don't know what I want. So my husband asks me all the time, like, what do you want to do next? I'm like, I don't know, we'll see what happens. And I think that's really an opportunity that you can get when you're in university. Like when you're younger, you have an opportunity to explore it while you're at school, to talk to people, to get your mentors, to talk to your professors and really find out where you fit.
So we have about 5 minutes or so left, and you've already done this, I think, a fair amount throughout this conversation. But I'd like to conclude with asking you both sort of final thoughts, advice that you'd give to current humanities students or students that are contemplating studying a humanities discipline in college. What advice would you give them as they prepare for their lives after graduation? Kelly, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. Giving advice to young people, kind of scary. I think there's two main messages for me. The first one would be to take chances. And the second would be to explore. And I think those are really the two most important things you can do when you're younger. And if you're not willing to take a chance, you're not really going to learn. And if you're not going to explore, you're not going to see what your opportunities are. So I guess those would be my 2 things.
I would echo the two that Kelly said, and I would also say, be open to opportunities. You should seek things out, But when things come to you, also just be open to them if they're not exactly what you thought you were going to be doing at a particular point in time. And the other is and this goes with the taking chances. I think you got to trust your gut, and you really, Kelly very eloquently spoke about sort of following your passion, and I think part and parcel of that is following your gut, right? So you know what you're interested in, and you'll know when you're questioning whether an opportunity is the right opportunity or something to pursue. I think you have to be confident that and be open to the fact that you may not actually be right. And sometimes being wrong is better than being right, because, and this is something Kelly also said earlier, figuring out what you don't want to do is just as valuable, especially early on, as figuring out what you do want to do. Because everything that you sort of check off the list helps you narrow down and focus what ultimately will be the hopefully nonlinear path that you want to take.
Well, I want to thank you both for giving us some of your time today and for such insightful and thoughtful observations. Kelly Kay, Louie Pastor, thank you both so much for joining us today. And for the audience, thank you for joining us.